living fully alive in every way. You're listening to Relationship Prescriptions with Dr. Carol.
How can you maintain connection and intimacy with your spouse while being a parent? This is Dr. Carol, and you're listening to Relationship Prescriptions. I know from you, because many of you have written or talked to me, that connection with your spouse, intimacy in all its facets, is a really big desire and sometimes a pain point that you are experiencing. One of the challenges to the intimacy between husband and wife can be parenting. Certainly, the joy of having a child, of bringing a new life into the world and raising them to be who God created them to be, is great. But that very becoming parents and raising a child or children adds certain challenges to the marriage. And to have a strong marriage that your children can be nurtured in, can learn from and model when they grow up is certainly a desire, not always easy. Well, my guests today talk about that intersection of marriage and parenting and faith, the role of faith in the middle of all of that. Daniel and Christina Ehm live in Edmonton, Alberta now. They have lived in 3 countries and have served churches in several different cities. Daniel is an author, a pastor, and a Gallup Strengths Performance coach. Christina is a social worker, a counselor, and an Enneagram enthusiast. They have 3 children, which you'll hear a bit about as we talk in our conversation today. They are also together hosting the In Between podcast, I Am Between podcast, about marriage, parenting, and faith. Some wonderful joy, practical input into these areas of life, and great chemistry between them. So, I hope you check out their podcast as well. But today we are going to specifically talk with Daniel and Christina about how can you preserve an intimate marriage while being parents. That doesn't happen automatically. And you'll hear some of the things that Christina and Daniel have done in their own marriage and that they encourage others to do as well to preserve that connection between you and your spouse along with raising your children. I think you will enjoy this. You will probably chuckle, may smile, and may even laugh occasionally. So here is my conversation with Christina and Daniel Ehm. Christina and Daniel Ehm, it is such a pleasure to have you here. Your work on parenting, on relationships, on faith. I think this combination is going to be so helpful for our listeners, and welcome to our program.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Carol, for having us. We are just so thrilled to be here with you and your podcast audience.
Yeah, it's a joy.
The things that the two of you talk about, I think, are perhaps especially important now in this season when families, when marriages are going through extra stress, all that's gone on with and still going on with, the pandemic as well as just the normal stuff. And you guys have such a fascinating story. For people who haven't become aware of you in the past, maybe let me just give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your relationship and maybe point out a couple of the challenges that you have faced that have helped make you who you are as a couple and as a family.
Well, I love how you're talking about how the challenges make us who we are, because I think in the beginning of our relationship, if you had told us that, we would have laughed in your face, Dr. Carol. Like, why do we have to go through the hard times? Why can't we just live through the good times and ride on those waves, right, Daniel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we could tell you story after story of how obviously we didn't like any of the challenges, but how they've shaped us. So yeah, I've been married 14 years next week at least at the time of this recording, and have 3 children, almost 11 girl, a 9-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy. And we've moved around quite a bit, but I guess in the last year in particular, I think it's been interesting to see what COVID has done to our marriage, because we know there's research out there on how stressful it has been on marriages, but honestly, I think it's just really brought to light what was. So I don't think COVID and the challenge of COVID and everything that comes around with it necessarily introduced a whole nother thing that made or broke marriages. But I think it was kind of like you're dusting off the dirt and seeing what's underneath the surface. And that's definitely been an interesting thing this past year.
Right. And I would go on even further in the 14 years that we have been married, the 16 years that we've been together, some of the things that we talk about on our own podcast, but is just in our normal everyday lives. We have been unemployed. Both of us lost our jobs in Korea suddenly when we had a 5-month-old. We were homeless as we came back from Korea to live with Daniel. Your parents were so kind in taking us in. Yeah. We lost family members unexpectedly, not due to COVID and in other ways. And we've had children who have been sick, family members who have been sick. There's just been a lot that has gone on in the challenges. In the past year with the pandemic, we were into car accidents. We moved countries. We started school. We ended school, came homeschooling, all of that. And I think in the end, if we were to look back, if we were to write a memoir today, and one of the things that the challenges has really brought out in us is that our faith in God has been solidified continuously. Both of us are Christians, and that understanding that we don't have to have the whole picture. This is really important for me, that I don't need to have the whole picture to trust God, because I can look in the past in the ways that he has provided for us over and over again, and realizing that he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And the other part with our marriage is realizing that we are on the same team, that we are not enemies. And that is really important, because I think we do have an enemy out there who's really wanting to, destroy and kill marriages and rip them apart, because the generation after generations that happen with broken families, that's what the enemy wants to do. So when we can realize that being married, being of one flesh, that we are together as one before God, and being able to live day in and day out with that amongst the challenges.
I so appreciate that, seeing your spouse not as the enemy. I hear from married people often. A lot of my listeners and readers will write to me or sometimes call. And a common question or perspective is, my spouse is doing this, and if I could just get them to start or stop, doing this, then I'd be happy. They're the problem. Can you tell me what to do to fix them? Seeing them as the enemy. And your perspective that you articulated, Christina, of working together in solving these problems, I believe can make such a difference in so many couples, just to hold on to that one thing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. In James chapter 1 in the Bible, it says, "Hey, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry,
and abounding in love."
And what's interesting about that passage in particular, especially as it relates to challenges and conflict, is I wonder what would happen if in every marriage, right? If in every marriage, in every conflict, we actually start with listening, being quick to listen rather than quick to blame, quick to listen rather than being quick to speak. And then first off, right away, recognize, hey, okay, I am right now feeling like this is 100% their fault, but what have I actually done to contribute to this? Right. Because it's never, in every conflict and challenge, it's never 100% one person's fault. It might be 99% their fault. And it'll feel like sometimes it's 120% their fault, but it's never completely one-sided. So with that posture of being quick to listen, and how God also says that he opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble, how do we, after catching our breath and letting the adrenaline and all that stuff, melt away, we actually say, okay, what have I done? Instead of going to the blame, we actually start with, what have I done to contribute to this? I found that has time and time again diffused our conflicts, which we still have.
Oh yeah, all the
even
time.
A couple weeks ago, a really big one. And before, it might have taken days, maybe weeks. And now it's really gone to the point of, okay, it's now taking hours. Hopefully it'll get to minutes. It's still hours for us.
Years, baby.
It's still hours for us, where it's hours between resolution. But that's, I think, a huge, it's something that I think we can all get better at.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that, Daniel, especially in our marriage too, that we always say that we are not perfect, but thankfully we are children of God. And along with that, if we can see our spouse and remember, if I can remember Daniel, my husband, is a child of God, is a son of God, and treat him like that with respect, with love, with unconditional love that the Father shows us, and vice versa. If he can remember that I, his wife, is also a daughter of the King, a daughter of God, then how we would be able to have that, maybe it's a small perspective shift, maybe it's a huge perspective shift for each of your listeners of how we can treat each other in that way as well.
Beautiful. One of the things I hear from many of our married listeners, that a challenge for them has to do with intimacy, sex, and things like around that whole area of life. And one of the perspectives that the two of you, I know, care passionately about is how marriage and parenting can fit together. And ask any parent, the bedroom becomes a bigger challenge when little ones come along. Right. And let's just get real and get right into the ways in which parenting can impact the relationship between you, the connection, physical and otherwise, but just how that impacts the marriage part. So talk a little bit about what you've learned about that.
Well, it's interesting in other podcast interviews that we've done with sex therapists and other people who write about sexual intimacy, that when we think of intimacy, sometimes we just solely focus on the physical or the sexual, as we would say, but there's actually other parts to intimacy. So yes, there's the physical and the sexual, but there's also the emotional intimacy, and there's also the spiritual intimacy. And so sometimes, especially let's say in the beginning of your parenting journey, so your wife just had a baby, and there's that 6 weeks of you're not, whether it's a C-section or other ways that you are not supposed to be physically intimate in the bedroom. And so sometimes people can feel like, well, we're not doing anything, so what are we supposed to do? And even after the 6 weeks, perhaps it doesn't feel the same. So there's other ways. Yes, there's physical ways to be intimate, but I think we need to focus on other ways, especially emotional and spiritual, that we can bond together. So emotional, we use the 5 love languages by Gary Chapman. We've talked about that a lot, where for me, it's quality time and physical touch. So yes, I love when Daniel plays with my hair and he gives me a massage, but I also really appreciate other forms of if he wants to really sit down and spend time with me and ask me how my day was and so on and so forth. So I think the emotional, that part. How about yourself, honey?
Well, I think, just to go off what you were saying, we've experienced moments where, it might be many days or even more than a week where we haven't been intimate sexually because we're not sleeping during the night.
Right.
And the kids are coming to the bed, and even during the day, we're so stressful and we're trying to live off of caffeine. And it's just, that's the last thing. And I know it's might be the last thing on Christina's mind. It's not the last thing on my mind as the guy, but for me, it's how do I, as a husband, shepherd and also cultivate and help Christina know how much she is loved and know how much I love her and then know my needs and know her needs. And so I think that's the part where it can just be so convoluted, especially when children arrive and they're infants or they're toddlers, or even if they're a little bit older and they just can't sleep and they keep on coming to your bed, right, in the middle of the night. Like, what does that look like? And for marriages to thrive, there needs to be a healthy foundation of communication. So for Christina and I, if we ever get to the point where the intimacy tanks are lacking from an emotional side, a sexual side, or a physical side, it has to come to communication. Otherwise, I think the natural result is we will either shut each other out or we'll get our tanks filled elsewhere. Now, I know there's unhealthy ways to get it filled, and we're definitely not proponents of pornography and emotional affairs and all. I mean, that can be just so destructive. And if you don't believe me, just read the book of Proverbs one a day. You'll be convinced. You'll see the other side of it if you're entertaining that at all. But I think the side that we don't often talk about is how our emotional intimacy tanks can be filled by our children. From connecting with them, or even how our physical intimacy tanks can be filled with our children because of cuddling or nursing or caring for them, that so much so that the sexual intimacy side of things is just, it kind of goes out the side door, and you don't realize until it's possibly too late.
So, and I think the part, Daniel, where you're talking that the communication aspect is so important. And even if you don't, listeners, if you don't have children now, you can still work on your couple intimacy without children and just in your conversations with each other. Because let's say that Daniel's just really busy and I feel like I'm lacking in the emotional intimacy part of my tank. And if I go to him, it's very vulnerable. It is to go to your spouse, even though you know each other maybe the most out of everybody else in your life, and be like, I don't feel like you're meeting those needs for me. I feel like I'm not important. I feel like your work is so on and so forth. There's two things that can happen. One is that Daniel can turn to me and show me love and maybe even apologize and say, how are ways that we can fill your emotional intimacy tank? Or he can turn around and feel perhaps blamed and guilty and convicted and then just shut down, or maybe react in anger and be like, how dare you do this? I've been providing for you during this pandemic. I am here for everything, so on and so forth. And so if that's your usual reaction to your spouse, then that is going to shut down a lot more than just emotional intimacy. That is going to shut down intimacy in general.
I love you talking about the different facets of intimacy, and it's not just sex. And I believe that 100%. And perhaps statistically, men understand that less than women, but it can be a factor on either side. I understood, especially what you were saying, Daniel, in talking about, parenting, that if you allow your children to fill up the parts in your soul that should be reserved for your spouse, that can become a dangerous road. Yeah. And I just wanted to circle back and talk about that for a second, because yes, your children do need love and you receive love from them, but there's certain places that your spouse is God designed it, that this place in your soul is for your spouse.
Right.
Yeah, completely. And that goes to just quickly to the latest book that my last book that I wrote. I talk about these 7 lies that we believe. And one of the 7 lies within the book is a lie, really what we're talking about, that you are who you raise. And this is a lie that as parents, there's so many unintended consequences on our marriage, like Dr. Carol, you're pointing out here. But this lie that oftentimes parents believe, that we are who we raise, can really, that really is the foundation of that. Because it's like, oh, no. Well, isn't it good for me to overly care for? Isn't it good for me to be with my kids more? And yeah. I mean, I'm going to be with my spouse forever, but I'm not going to always have my kids around. So I'm going to invest more. I'm going to do more for them. And we think, because it sounds culturally appropriate, that, hey, we should be putting that much more time into our children, because what would we do the opposite? I mean, that doesn't sound right either. The problem is the unintended consequence of how that could just sow so many seeds of discord, perhaps, where your spouse can become jealous of your children, together. And it's like, how does that even make sense? But it really is intertwined.
what would be some suggestions or thoughts for parents married who they are struggling to maintain a sense of connection between the two of them in a busy season with kids, maybe 3 like you guys have. And it's in the middle of a pandemic. And so everybody's around all the time and the stress levels are even more than normal. And as you were saying at the beginning, this kind of stressful season uncovers even more of what's in your heart than you can't cover it up as easily now. So any practical things that parents might do even during those busy seasons to maintain that connection?
Yeah, definitely. I'll let Christina address bids and flirting and some other things that we can do during the day because she's incredible at explaining that side of it and really good at it too. So. But what I'll just say super quickly. So as a pastor, sacred spaces are often something that, we associate with faith. And, we're not in this sacred space of a church. We are the church, but we're not really in that or in most parts of this world, with the pandemic and all that stuff. So what's interesting is there can be sacred spaces in your house and sacred spaces in your relationship as well that can really be a place of investment and nurturing into one another. So I'll give you an example. We obviously think of the bedroom as one, and we don't have a TV in our bedroom. We don't have our home offices in our bedroom. We don't talk about work or even really podcasting or anything like that in our bedroom because that's that sacred space for us. But another one for us is our deck. For Mother's Day this past year, I installed these lights. It's pretty popular where you have these string lights outside. So we have a pergola and on our deck. So I did all this research to install. How do you install string lights onto siding on one side and onto a pergola on the other? So I did all this.
That won't break in the wind.
That's exactly, and all that stuff. And I installed all of this, and we have a nice outdoor seating area, and that's really become a sacred space for Christina and I, where the kids are in bed, and maybe your kids aren't old enough to watch themselves, or the budget's too tight to hire babysitters, but you can create sacred spaces in your home where they are in bed and we are just outside, but we have candle lits, we have a blanket, and we're just chatting over our favorite drinks and just creating these moments where we can be intimate with one another.
Dr. Carol, I love how you asked this question because even on our podcast, on our own, we always talk about the nitty gritty. Like, yes, we love the philosophies, we love the theories, but tell us how it works day in and day out. So I have a few suggestions that your podcast audience may be able to even use today. So sometimes when we're in the middle of the thickness of parenting, we don't understand what we're doing. We don't really see what the goals are. So sometimes if we can project what our life wants to be like when the kids have left, when we're empty nesters, what are the things that we would love to do? So for example, my parents, they are now empty nesters. They have been for quite a while. They love to have a weekly date night where they go out to try new restaurants. This is their thing. And this is the thing that they count on. They know my mom looks forward to it because on Saturday night, she does not have to do the dishes. She does not have to decide what to do or what to make. And so this is what they want to do. And this is what they consider fun. So for Daniel and I, when we were in the very fix of parenting in the beginning, when there is no way we would take our children out to a restaurant, especially a new one where we didn't know if they would have high chairs or not, or they didn't know how they would react to noodles on their floor. This is not what we would do. However,
just noodles?
Yeah.
Like their whole dinner on the floor.
Exactly. And then they'll be on the floor eating the noodles.
Yes.
That's what kids do. But then thinking about, okay, in the future, this is something what they want to do. It's not necessarily about the eating out. It's about the adventure. It's about having fun together. So going back into how can we have fun together? I think as we have dated, and if you look back on your own relationships, podcast listeners, what in your dating relationship, what are the ways that you had fun? What are the ways that you got to know each other? What are the ways that you spent time enjoying each other's presence? And now, what are things that you can do to continue to have fun? Those those may not be like if you went skydiving every weekend as a couple who were dating, that may not be able what you can do now, but is it something that maybe you can take up a sport together? Maybe you can run together. And in those times, put the kids in the stroller, give them some fishy crackers, and you can talk, or you can take, 10-minute breaks and go try a different trail. And every 10 minutes, you ask each other a question that you haven't asked or you haven't asked in a long time. I love, this is a free app, actually. Dr. Gottman, John Gottman, he does Love Decks. And so it's literally questions about all different topics. There's intimacy, there's love maps, there's finances, there's so on and so forth, where it literally, you just load it up and then you can choose what you want to talk about and you press it and a question comes up. So if you don't even know what questions to ask your spouse, maybe you're tired of asking the same questions, like what do you want for dinner? You can try this app as well. So Daniel, you talked about bids and you talked about flirting and all of that. So bids is another thing that Dr. John Gottman talks about for, if your podcast listeners don't know who he is, he's a research psychologist and he has studied relationships for over 40 years. And so bids are basically asks for connection. And depending on how your spouse reacts is how the conversation will go on. So a bid can be anything. It could be, so let's say Daniel and I are in the kitchen and I say, hey, the weather looks really nice today. And he says absolutely nothing. Okay, try again. Hey, what do you want to do for lunch? It looks like it's nice outside. Maybe we can barbecue. Absolutely nothing. And then what do I think? In my own head, I think he's not listening or he doesn't care or he is just preoccupied and I may just walk away. And that emotional connection that I was bidding for didn't happen. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, let's say I came up to him and I said, hey, it looks like a nice day. And he responds, yes, it's a beautiful day. And then I can respond being like, hey, do you want to go for a walk after dinner? And then he responds, yes, that would be a great idea. Now, this doesn't seem like any scientific rocket science, but the fact that if you can look at your spouse and realize that perhaps when your spouse is talking to you, they are looking for a bid of connection. Mm-hmm. So instead of looking at them maybe like, oh, you're annoying me, or why are you telling about the weather? Like, come on, the weather happens every single day. We don't need to talk about this. But looking at your spouse and maybe seeking to understand what is the bid for connection? What are they actually trying to say beneath the words that they're using? Mm-hmm.
Those are great ideas and aren't rocket science. Like you said, these are very practical. And thanks for getting that nitty gritty, because as I see couples, it's those micro investments as well as the bigger investments, but it's those little things that either add to the bank account or take away from it. Mm-hmm. So the more times you can, as you guys have said, fill up that intimacy tank intentionally, sometimes in small ways, but that make a big difference, the long-lasting implications of that.
Right.
Right now in this season, in August or 1st of September, depending on when you're listening to this, school is starting. Mm-hmm. And in the middle of pandemic, oh my, parents and kids, and it may look different. I know some parents may be doing homeschool this year that had never done it in the past. Some are choosing remote learning at home to keep their children safe. But whatever it is, this season is different. For many families, perhaps, and adds stress to the home, to perhaps even to the relationship. How have you guys wrestled with that? And what is this season looking like for you?
Well, Dr. Carol, we are actually homeschooling this year. Mm-hmm. And a little bit about our background. So our oldest is now going into grade 5, but as soon as she hit kindergarten, we prayed every single year if this is the year that we should homeschool. Not that their school was negative or they were having any issues, but just kind of laying our plans before God every school school year and be like, what do you have for us this year? And every year it just seemed like it was like, nope, not this year. And so we would pray about it. Grade 1, nope, not this year. And here we are in the middle of the pandemic and just continuing to lay our plans before God and saying, okay, God, is this year to homeschool? And that was a really difficult choice for us just because this was the year that all 3 kids were supposed to go off to school full time.
Oh, and we were so, as a pastor, I have Mondays off. So we were just, this last year, I mean, at least until COVID hit, I mean, we had half days on Mondays together. And we were just like, oh, look at all the amazing things we're going to do on our Mondays just together. And then,
it's like empty nesters from like 9 to 3.
Yeah.
Not so much anymore.
No, not with homeschooling.
Right. Yeah. But we just really felt this year. And first of all, I want to say to your podcast listeners, whatever choice you decide, that is the right choice for your family. No one can predict the future. No one's going to know what's going to happen. So please don't hear us talking about our decision and thinking that we are trying to convince you one way or another.
Sure.
So, but when we were thinking about homeschooling and what the values and the things that we wanted our children to come from this year, out of this year, was really just foster a love for learning and also just be able to have consistency in their schooling. So regardless if we traveled or we didn't, or if COVID numbers went up in our city or in our town and the schools had to shut down, we already had a plan in place.
Yeah, and that was really huge for us because early on in the pandemic, structure, I mean, our brains are just on such high alert of this change, that change, this change, and how do we have a sense of consistency? And for us, we needed to build that for our kids because even as adults, it was, I mean, everyone was trying to, we were just so disrupted and yeah, we have more emotional maturity than our children, but just trying to help our children process everything that was going on. So just to give your sense, your listeners a sense of who we are. I mean, we go to restaurants, like we still go to restaurants. We have our masks on, we take them off when we eat, but we are very pro going out and trying to get on with life as normal. So we're not hunkering down or in any way. And on the other side, we were such huge proponents of the public school system. But this year in particular, as we were really trying to figure out, okay, how do we as parents, not worrying about the rest of culture and society and everything else, but really for our children, how do we create a sense of structure and consistency? And this was one of the ways that we were able to do it.
Right. And we also had the conversation of now that we know the kids are going to be home full time and we don't get those Mondays off that we dreamed about for since the beginning of our children going to school, we've also had to have those conversations of what does it look like to carve out time together. So thankfully, our oldest is able to take care of the kids for an hour or two. She's taken the babysitting course. She's ready to do that. So even if that means we love biking, and so that's something we love to do together. And so we'll go on a bike ride. Maybe that means as the kids are going to bed later because they are older, then we can steal an hour in the morning to be on the deck and have coffee together.
Exactly,
yeah. And the one thing that I will always look back and just be like, goodness, I have the best husband ever. When we were talking about homeschooling, we both knew, but he pointed it out in our relationship saying, babe, I know homeschooling is going to fall mostly on your shoulders because you are going to be their teacher. And so he's like, no matter what the decision is, he's like, I support you. And he also asked me, he's like, and how can I support you? How are the ways that, knowing that he's not going to be the full-time teacher, but how are different ways that Daniel can support me? And I just felt so loved and so appreciated with just that gesture, with that offer of, first of all, realizing and validating that it's going to be a lot of work on my side, but also offering different ways that he can just love me through serving.
Thanks for sharing that and really working together in making those decisions. And it seems like you have illustrated in some wonderful ways something I remember that Paul said, preferring one another above yourselves, seeing each other as better. It's not that you don't matter, but that when you commit to marriage, that you commit to really looking after your spouse's well-being. Both husband and wife commit to that.
Yeah, 100%.
You guys talk together all the time on your podcast, and I don't want to leave our conversation without giving you a moment to mention to our listeners and encourage them to add another podcast to their downloads and to tell us about the In Between podcast.
Well, the In Between, so it's I Am Between. It's a little play off our last name, which is Daniel and Christina M. I Am. So we talk about parenting, marriage, faith, and everything in between. And really the sole goal and focus of our podcast is to give people the tools to build strong and connected and joy-filled marriages and families. So you're able to find us on our website, inbetween.org. You can find us on any podcasting app. We're also at In Between Show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So you can follow along with us as we start this homeschooling journey. We are pretty candid in the ways that we succeed, but we are really candid in the ways that we fail. Yes. So if you'd like to follow along in that journey, and if there's any way that we can serve you and your audience, if there's any things that we've talked about that you're wanting to hear more about, we probably have a podcast episode about it. And if we don't, we will look to the future of maybe creating one for that.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks so much. And we'll make sure the links to all of that is in the show notes for this episode. So if you happen to be jogging or driving, just make sure you come back to the show notes and we'll make sure the links are there. This has been so much fun. It's been so uplifting. Thank you, Christina and Daniel, for sharing your life and following Jesus as husband and wife and parents and sharing that journey with others. God's rich blessings to you.
Thank you, Dr. Carol.
Thank you, and same to you.
Well, parenting is never easy, and maintaining your relationship while parenting certainly takes being intentional. And I love how Daniel and Christina illustrate the intentional investment of energy in doing exactly that. If you check the show notes for this episode, you'll find links to the In Between podcast webpage and some of their social media. Check that out. Daniel also has written a number of books, and you might want to check out his books as well. A very thoughtful perspective on some important theological issues as well. I want to say thank you for being part of our podcast family. And I love hearing from you. When I hear from you, it lets me know that we're addressing things that matter to you. I would encourage you to go to our website, drcarolministries.com, click on the Contact Us page, and leave me a comment or a question, whether it's something about this episode or another episode on the podcast, or perhaps an idea that you'd like us to talk about on a future episode. That would mean a whole lot. It would also mean a lot if you would tell somebody else about our podcast. Share it, let some of your friends know, or share about it on social media. That would be great. Thank you again for being part of this online podcast family. And until next time, may God bless you.
Thank you for listening to Relationship Prescriptions with Dr. Carol. Our purpose is to provide trustworthy resources that help you and others live fully alive in every way as God intended. If you would like to help others experience transformation in their lives and relationships, we invite you to partner with us. Text the word GIVE, that's GIVE, to the number 512-980-1620. Or visit our website at drcarolministries.com/donate to make a one-time contribution or monthly gift. Your financial support allows us to expand our message and to help others. Thank you so much. and may God bless you.